My beloved child. There is a moment in every story when confusion can no longer hide behind coincidence. A moment when the little things that never made sense suddenly begin forming a picture, and someone you love finally stops asking, "Why is this happening to us?" and starts asking a much harder question, "Who has been standing between us?" This is a fictional spiritual story, but if your heart has ever felt the weight of being misunderstood, stay with me, because what happens next begins with something almost impossible to notice. It happened on an ordinary evening. No thunder. No dramatic warning. Just rain tapping softly against a bedroom window while the person you love sat alone beneath the pale light of a phone screen. They had been scrolling through old conversations, not because they wanted to reopen the past, but because something about the past suddenly looked different. A sentence that once seemed harmless now felt strangely calculated. A delay that once seemed accidental suddenly had a reason. And one name kept appearing around every disagreement the two of you had ever experienced. They leaned back slowly, their breathing changing. What if I was looking in the wrong direction all along? That question frightened them not because it suggested something terrible, but because it meant they might have judged you unfairly. How many moments between you had been shaped by information that wasn't complete? How many times had they believed a story before hearing your side? And if someone had been quietly influencing the distance between you, why had that person been so determined to keep you apart? The next morning, something unusual happened. Instead of sending you another guarded message, they opened an old conversation with someone they trusted. They searched for a specific exchange from months earlier. Their fingers stopped above the screen. There it was. A message they had completely forgotten. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even dramatic. It was a simple statement about you, something supposedly said by someone close to the situation. But when they reread it now, one detail didn't fit. The wording was too specific. The timing was wrong. And most importantly, they remembered that you had told them something completely different that same day. For the first time, doubt moved away from you and toward the person who had delivered the information. But that created a new question. If that message wasn't true, what else had been changed before it ever reached them? They began searching quietly. Not obsessively. Not angrily. Carefully. They opened conversations. They checked dates. They remembered places. They compared what they had been told with what had actually happened. And slowly, a strange pattern emerged. Every time the two of you had gotten close to understanding each other, something had interrupted it. A rumor appeared. A misunderstood sentence surfaced. Someone suddenly needed their attention. A private conversation somehow became public. And every time, the result was almost identical. You pulled away hurt, they became defensive, and the distance between you grew. But there was something neither of you had noticed. The person creating the confusion never had to tell an enormous lie. They only needed to tell small truths in the wrong order. That realization changed the atmosphere completely. The person you love placed the phone down and stared across the room. They remembered one night when you had tried desperately to explain yourself while they had refused to listen. They remembered your expression, not anger, but disappointment. They remembered how you had said, "I wish you would just ask me before believing someone else." At the time, those words had sounded defensive. Now they sounded heartbreaking. They whispered, "You were trying to tell me." And suddenly the silence in the room felt different. Not empty. Full of things that had never been said. Yet there was still one problem. They didn't know whether the person behind the confusion had acted out of jealousy, fear, resentment, or something much more complicated. And before they confronted anyone, they needed certainty. One mistake could destroy another relationship. One accusation without proof could create an even deeper wound. So they waited. That afternoon, an unexpected notification appeared. It was from someone they hadn't heard from in a long time. The message contained only one sentence. "I think you deserve to know what really happened." They read it once. Then again. Their heart began beating faster. Because the sender was someone who had been present during one of the moments when everything between you had first started changing. They opened the message. There was a screenshot attached. And suddenly, the story they had believed for months developed a crack. The screenshot showed a conversation between two people. Your name was mentioned. Their name was mentioned. And beneath those names was a statement that made the person you love sit completely still. Someone had been discussing how to keep the two of you from talking directly. Not how to hurt you. Not how to destroy your lives. Something more subtle. They had been discussing how to make sure every attempt at communication became complicated. The person you love's eyes filled with tears. Because they remembered every unanswered message. Every awkward silence. Every moment when one of you had assumed the other no longer cared. And now they were beginning to understand that some of those silences may never have belonged to either of you. But the screenshot ended before the most important part. There was another message below it. Cut off. Hidden. The sender had deliberately covered the final lines. "Why did you hide this part?" they typed. The reply came several minutes later. "Because I wasn't sure you were ready." They stared at the words. Then came another message. "You need to understand something before you confront them. The person you think started all of this isn't the person who benefited most from it." That sentence changed everything. Because suddenly the mystery was no longer about who had caused the misunderstandings. It was about why. What did someone gain by keeping you apart? Who became more important whenever your connection weakened? And why had someone who appeared innocent been so close to the center of every misunderstanding? The person you love stood and walked toward the window. Rainwater traced crooked paths down the glass. Somewhere outside, a car passed through the wet street, its headlights briefly illuminating the room. They thought about calling you. Their thumb hovered over your name. But they stopped. Not because they didn't want to hear your voice. Because for the first time, they wanted to hear the entire truth before saying another word. Then their phone vibrated again. Another message. This time there was no screenshot. No explanation. Only a photograph. They opened it. Their face changed instantly. It was a picture taken months earlier, on a day they had always believed was the beginning of the biggest misunderstanding between you. But in the background stood someone neither of you had ever suspected. Someone who had told them they weren't there. Someone who had insisted they knew nothing about what happened. And suddenly, the person you love understood why the story had never quite made sense. They zoomed in. Their hands began to tremble. Because the person in the background wasn't merely present. They were holding the phone. The same phone that had supposedly been somewhere else at that exact moment. The same device connected to the message that had started the argument between you. For several seconds, they couldn't breathe normally. Then they whispered the words that had been waiting months to be spoken. I trusted you. But they weren't speaking to you. They were speaking to the person in the photograph. And just when they thought they had finally uncovered the truth, another message appeared beneath the picture. I need to show you what happened 5 minutes after this photo was taken. They stared at the screen. Their finger moved toward the message. And before they could open it, your name appeared on their phone. You were calling. For the first time in months, neither of you knew what the other was about to say. But somewhere between the old lies, the hidden messages, and the truth that was finally beginning to surface, one thing had changed forever. They were no longer calling to defend themselves. They were calling because they were finally ready to listen. And what they were about to hear from you would reveal a detail neither of you had ever known, one that would lead directly to the person who had been quietly shaping the story from the beginning. The call connected. Neither of you spoke. And then, in a trembling voice, they asked the question that could no longer be avoided. Tell me what really happened that day, because I just found something with your name on it. My beloved child. For a few seconds, neither of you said anything. The silence on the call was not empty. It carried the weight of every conversation that had ended too soon, every explanation that had been interrupted, every assumption that had been allowed to grow because neither of you knew what the other had actually heard. On the other end, the person you loved was staring at the photograph again, waiting for you to answer a question you didn't even fully understand. What do you mean, you found something with my name on it? Your voice was quiet. Not defensive. Not angry. Just confused. And that confusion told them more than any argument could have. They closed their eyes. I don't know how to explain this, they said. But I think I've been wrong about something for a very long time. You didn't rush to respond. Instead, you asked the one question they hadn't expected. Who showed you the picture? They froze. Because you had asked that question immediately. Not, what picture? Not, what did you find? You already knew there was something. And suddenly, they wondered whether you had been carrying a piece of this mystery alone. I'll tell you, they whispered. But first, I need to know something. Did you ever send a message to me on the night we stopped speaking? Your breathing changed. Yes. Their eyes opened. What did you say? You remembered. You had written a long message that night. You had explained what had happened, apologized for the part you believed was yours, and asked for one honest conversation without anyone else involved. Then you waited. And waited. No response came. You eventually assumed they had read your message and chosen silence. But when you told them what you had written, they went completely still. I never received that. The word seemed to divide the past into two different realities. You had sent it. They had never seen it. Someone had somehow stood between the message and the person it was meant for. And suddenly, an old memory returned to them with painful clarity. That night, someone had told them, they didn't contact you. They're giving you space. They had believed it. They had even felt relieved for a moment, thinking you had finally decided to move on. But you had never chosen silence. You had reached across it. Someone else had simply made sure your hand never reached them. The realization was devastating because it meant the distance between you hadn't always been created by what you said. Sometimes it had been created by what never arrived. They pulled the photograph closer. There's something else, they said. You heard paper moving. Then a drawer opening. I found an old envelope. What was inside? A copy of your message. Your heart stopped. You hadn't kept a copy. You hadn't even known one existed. They explained that months earlier, the person they had trusted most had handed them a printed page and claimed it was evidence that you had written something hurtful about them. But now, looking at the page again, they noticed something they had never questioned. The handwriting on the envelope wasn't yours. The date was wrong. And the message itself contained phrases you would never use. Someone had taken your words, rearranged them, removed entire sentences, and presented the result as if it were your confession. But why go that far? Why spend months constructing a version of reality that required so much effort to maintain? The answer came from an unexpected place. A mutual friend called. They had heard that the truth was beginning to surface, and they were terrified of what might happen next. I should have told you earlier, the friend said. The person you love gripped the phone tighter. Told me what? There was a long pause. I saw someone meeting them. Who? Another pause. Then the name was spoken. It was the name of the person neither of you had considered dangerous to your relationship because they had always presented themselves as a supporter. The helpful one. The concerned one. The person who always seemed to appear whenever either of you was upset. And suddenly, every memory involving them looked different. They had always known when you were arguing. They had always known when you weren't speaking. They somehow knew private details that neither of you remembered sharing. They had offered advice at exactly the moments when emotions were highest. At the time, it had felt like kindness. Now it felt like access. The person you love sat down. Why didn't you tell me? I was scared. Of them? No. The friend swallowed. Of what they'd do if I told you. That answer changed the energy of the entire conversation. Because now there was another layer. This wasn't simply about jealousy or interference. Someone had created an environment where people were afraid to speak. The person you love asked, "What did you see?" The friend answered slowly. They weren't alone. With who? I don't know the name. Then describe them. Another silence. They were carrying a folder. Your heart tightened when you heard that detail. A folder. You suddenly remembered something from months earlier. A conversation you'd had with the same person. They had once asked you an oddly specific question about your relationship, something that had seemed harmless at the time. You had answered without thinking. Now you realized what they might have been collecting. Information. Dates. Names. Private details. Weak points. Moments of uncertainty. Not because they cared about either of you, but because information becomes powerful when people don't know who else possesses it. The person you love opened the folder. Inside were copies of conversations. Not just between you and them. Conversations involving friends, relatives, and people who had never realized their words were being saved. There were dates written in the margins. Short notes. Questions. Observations. And beside several conversations was the same handwritten symbol. A small circle. The person you loved didn't understand it. Then they found a page at the very bottom. One sentence was written across it. Keep them from talking directly until the right moment. They stared at those words. The right moment. Not forever. Not permanently. Until the right moment. That meant the person interfering had never been trying to end your relationship completely. They had been trying to control when the two of you would finally understand each other. And that was far more unsettling. Because it suggested there had been a plan. A sequence. A reason for every delay. A reason for every misunderstanding. A reason certain truths appeared only after the damage had already been done. Then they noticed another document. This one had your name. Beneath it was a date in the future. Their expression changed. What is this? The friend looked over. I've never seen that page. They picked it up. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a handwritten timeline. But then they read the final line. If they reconnect before this date, everything falls apart. They looked at the calendar. The date was only 3 days away. Suddenly, the entire mystery became urgent. Someone had expected you to reconnect. Someone had been watching the timing. Someone had believed there was still enough influence left to stop it. The person you love immediately reached for the phone. They called you again. This time, when you answered, they didn't ask about the photograph. They didn't ask about the messages. They asked something much more personal. Do you still trust me enough to hear something difficult? You took a breath. I don't know. They closed their eyes. That answer hurt, but it was honest. And honesty was exactly what had been missing. I deserve that, they said. For the first time, neither of you tried to sound stronger than you felt. They admitted they had doubted you. You admitted there were moments when you had stopped believing they cared. They confessed that some of their coldness had been built from things they were told. You confessed that some of your distance had come from believing their silence was deliberate. Two people finally discovered that they had been grieving the same relationship from opposite sides of the same misunderstanding. And then came the question that neither of you wanted to ask. Do you think we can fix this? You didn't answer immediately. Instead, you said, I think we can find out what happened. They smiled through tears. That wasn't a promise. It was something better. It was permission to seek the truth without pretending the wounds didn't exist. But before the conversation could continue, a notification appeared on their phone. The sender was the same person who had supposedly been helping them through everything. The message contained only 6 words. "You need to stop digging now." Their face went pale. Because the sender couldn't have known they were digging. Unless someone had been watching. They looked toward the folder. Then toward the window. Then back at the phone. Another message arrived. "This isn't about keeping you apart." A second message appeared. "It's about protecting you from what you'll discover if you keep going." The person you love stared at the screen. For the first time, they understood that the story was much bigger than a simple attempt to create conflict. Someone had been hiding something. Something connected to the past. Something they believed would change how you saw them. They slowly typed one question. "What are you afraid I'll find?" The typing indicator appeared. Stopped. Appeared again. Then disappeared. Minutes passed. Finally, the reply arrived. "You really don't remember what happened before you met them, do you?" Their hands went cold. Because there was one memory from years ago they had always considered insignificant. A brief encounter. A forgotten conversation. A promise made without understanding why it mattered. And suddenly, they remembered a face. Not clearly. Just enough. The same eyes from the photograph. The same person they had trusted. The same person who had spent months claiming they were only trying to help. They looked at your name on the screen. Then at the photograph. And a terrible possibility entered their mind, not that someone had recently decided to interfere with your relationship, but that this had begun long before either of you realized you were being watched. They opened the oldest document in the folder. The date at the top was years earlier. And beneath it was a sentence that made their entire body go still. "Wait until they fall in love. Then they'll never question why I was there." They couldn't move. They couldn't speak. And when you heard the silence through the phone, you asked, "What did you find?" They looked at the final page. Then whispered your name. Because the truth wasn't simply that someone had been creating problems between you. The truth was that this person had known one of you long before the relationship ever began. And they had been waiting for this exact moment. My beloved child. For several seconds, the person you love could not answer you. The page was still in their hand, but their eyes had stopped moving. The sentence at the bottom seemed to have erased everything else in the room. Years earlier. Before your relationship. Before the misunderstandings. Before the first argument that had made you wonder whether something beautiful between you was beginning to disappear. You spoke again. "What did you find?" They swallowed. "I think I finally understand why they knew so much." "Tell me." "They knew because they were there before you." The words landed softly, but they carried an enormous weight. Then the person you love began remembering. There had been a difficult season in their life years ago, a time when they felt isolated and uncertain. Someone had appeared then, offering friendship without asking for anything in return. They listened. They remembered details. They showed up at the right moments. They became familiar enough to feel safe. But one thing had always seemed strange. Whenever the person you loved tried to build a new chapter, that old friend somehow remained nearby. A warning here. A suggestion there. A carefully chosen story about someone they were beginning to trust. It had never looked like control. It had looked like concern. And that was precisely why it had worked. The person you love finally understood that the interference had not started when you entered their life. Your relationship had simply become the first thing they couldn't control without revealing themselves. They looked again at the folder. The documents weren't evidence of some perfect master plan. They were fragment screenshots, notes, half-truths, assumptions, conversations taken out of context. But together, they revealed something painfully human. Someone had become afraid of losing their place in another person's life. And instead of accepting that people change, they tried to preserve their importance by quietly damaging trust. That realization did not excuse what they had done. But it explained why the manipulation had always been disguised as protection. The person you love called the friend who had originally sent the photograph. "I need the whole story." The friend hesitated. "I was hoping you wouldn't have to hear it this way. I've already heard enough pieces. I need the truth." A long breath came through the phone. Then the friend confessed. They had known something was wrong for months. They had watched information being passed from one person to another. They had seen private conversations become rumors. They had even been asked to repeat certain things to you, believing at first that they were helping prevent another argument. But eventually, they realized something. Every attempt to help somehow produced more distance. Every warning created another misunderstanding. Every piece of advice left one of you more suspicious of the other. And once they understood the pattern, they stopped cooperating. That was when they took the photograph. That was when they preserved the messages. That was when they finally decided to tell the truth. The person you love asked the question that mattered most. Why now? The answer was simple. Because I watched you lose someone you loved because I was too afraid to speak. Silence followed. Then the person you love looked at your name on the phone. Their voice broke when they said, "I don't want that to happen again." You heard everything. Not only the explanation, but the regret beneath it. For months, you had believed that the person you loved simply didn't value what you shared enough to protect it. Now you understood something different. They had made mistakes. They had trusted the wrong voice. They had allowed fear and confusion to influence their decisions. But beneath all of that, there had still been a part of them trying to understand why losing you hurt so much. And that part had never disappeared. You didn't immediately say that everything was forgiven. You didn't pretend the wounds had vanished. Instead, you told them the truth. I can't erase what happened. I know. I can't promise I won't remember it. I know. And I can't rebuild trust in one conversation. There was a pause. Then they answered. I don't need you to. I just want the chance to earn it. Those words changed something. Not because they magically repaired everything. Because for once, neither of you was asking the other to forget. You were asking whether something honest could be built from what remained. That evening, you met. Not in some dramatic place. Not somewhere filled with perfect scenery. Just a quiet cafe near a street where the rain had finally stopped. You saw each other from across the room. For a moment, neither moved. There were too many memories between you. But there was something new as well. No intermediary. No messenger. No carefully edited version of what someone claimed had been said. Just you. Just them. And the truth. The person you love placed the folder on the table. I brought everything. You looked at it. Then you pushed it gently away. I don't need to know every cruel thing they said. They looked surprised. Then what do you need? You answered. I need to know what you believe now. Their eyes filled. I believe I should have asked you. You remained quiet. I believe I should have trusted what I knew about your heart instead of trusting someone else's version of you. They took a breath. And I believe that if we're ever going to have something real, nobody else gets to speak for either of us again. That was the moment the mystery finally began losing its power. Not because every question had been answered, but because the person who had created the confusion no longer controlled the conversation. The truth had returned to the people who had actually lived it. Later that night, the final confrontation happened. The person you love met the individual who had been interfering. There was no screaming. No dramatic revenge. Just one question. Why? The answer came after a long silence. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of becoming unnecessary. And there it was. The deepest truth. Not hatred. Not some mysterious force. Fear. A fear that had been allowed to become manipulation. A fear that had convinced someone they could preserve their place by controlling someone else's relationships. The person you love listened. Then said, "You could have told me you were afraid." The other person looked down. "I didn't know how." "You knew how to interfere." That sentence ended the conversation. Not with cruelty. With a boundary. The person you love walked away understanding something that would stay with them for the rest of their life. Compassion does not require permission for someone to keep hurting you. You can understand why someone acted the way they did and still decide they no longer get access to your peace. And that was exactly what happened. The interference ended. The old messages stopped. The rumors lost their audience. The people who had been confused finally heard the truth directly. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the relationship between you began changing. Not back into what it had been. Into something better. Because before, you had loved each other through assumptions. Now you were learning to love each other through communication. Before, silence had been interpreted. Now questions were asked. Before, a third person's opinion could change the entire atmosphere. Now you looked at each other and said, "Tell me yourself." That became the new rule. And over time, the wound that once seemed like proof that your connection was doomed became the reason you learned how to protect it. One evening, months later, the person you love sat beside you and said, "Do you know what hurts the most?" You looked at them. It isn't that someone tried to come between us. They paused. It's that for a while, we helped them do it. You understood. Because neither of you had been perfect. You had believed things without asking. They had withdrawn instead of explaining. Both of you had allowed uncertainty to become louder than what you actually knew about each other. But recognizing that did not make the story a failure. It made the ending meaningful. You had discovered that love isn't proven by never being tested. Sometimes it is revealed by what two people choose to do after trust has been shaken. And this time, you chose honesty. You chose boundaries. You chose patience. Most importantly, you chose not to let someone else's fear write the ending of your story. There was one final thing the person you loved kept from you until that evening. They had saved the original message you sent months earlier, the one that had never reached them. They had printed it. Not because they wanted to preserve the pain. Because they wanted to remember how close they had come to losing something precious simply because neither of you knew the whole truth. At the bottom of the page, they had written one sentence. "We should have talked sooner." You read it. Then smiled through tears. Maybe. They looked at you. "Do you regret meeting me?" You shook your head. No. Even after everything? You thought about the confusion. The distance. The unanswered questions. The people who had interfered. Then you looked at the person sitting in front of you. No. I regret that we lost time. But I don't regret finding the truth. And sometimes that is where healing begins. Not when the past becomes beautiful. But when the past finally stops controlling the future. So if this fictional story found a place in your heart, remember this: not every misunderstanding deserves a dramatic ending. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is ask directly, listen carefully, and refuse to let assumptions become permanent. The person who loves you may not always know how to express what they feel. You may not always know what is happening inside their heart. People can become confused. They can make poor choices. They can listen to the wrong voices. But genuine connection has a way of becoming stronger when truth is finally given room to breathe. And if someone has ever tried to place themselves between you and a person you care about, let this be your reminder: you don't have to fight them to reclaim your peace. You simply have to stop giving their version of the story more authority than your own experience. Let truth speak. Let boundaries protect you. Let forgiveness be something you choose freely, not something someone demands from you. And if reconciliation is possible, let it be built slowly, honestly, and with both people participating. May your heart be given clarity where confusion once lived. May the relationships meant to remain in your life become stronger through honesty. May you have the wisdom to recognize manipulation without allowing bitterness to take root. May you have the courage to walk away from what repeatedly harms your peace. And may the people who truly value you learn to speak to you directly, listen without judgment, and protect the trust between you. Whatever chapter you are living right now, may you never forget that one difficult season does not have to become the final sentence of your story. Sometimes the truth arrives late. Sometimes healing takes longer than expected. And sometimes two people discover that what they thought was the end was actually the moment they finally learned how to love each other honestly. If this story touched something inside you, stay connected for more cinematic stories of love, faith, healing, and hope. Share this video with someone who may need the reminder that truth can bring clarity even after a long season of confusion. And remember this as you leave. You don't have to chase what is genuine. You don't have to compete with someone else's version of you. You don't have to prove your heart to everyone. The people who truly belong in your life will eventually want to hear your truth from you. And when they do, may you have the courage to speak it. May you have the wisdom to listen. And may the love that remains after the truth is known be the kind of love that no misunderstanding can quietly steal again. Amen.